250%. Nobody ever talks about that. 250% tariff, which is taking advantage of our farmers, so that's not going to happen anymore. Canada has been ripping us off for years.
Dairy and lumber have been trade irritants for decades and of particular concern for Trump. CBC News has confirmed Trump went on a profanity-laced rant about dairy in a recent phone call with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. And now Trump says more tariffs are coming.
U.S. milk just lost its grip on Mexico, not because of price wars, but because of trust. Once sold cheaply, American milk prices in Mexico have now soared 275 to 300%, turning a competitive edge into a burden. Mexico didn't just adapt, it expanded its own dairy production and quietly swapped American imports for Canadian milk. That single move handed Canada $3.2 billion in market gains without a single headline-grabbing trade deal. Beneath the surface, a generational shift is reshaping demand. Young Mexican consumers want clean products free from growth hormones produced transparently and traceable from farm to shelf. Social media and the rise of sustainable consumption mean quality and standards now outweigh price. In this new dairy war, trust is the currency, and the U.S. is losing it in its own backyard. We break down the latest shifts in global markets. If that's something you care about, drop a like and subscribe to stay ahead. U.S. milk's loss of trust in Mexico didn't just play out on grocery shelves, it showed up in the trade data almost immediately. In 2023, Mexico made up a quarter of all U.S. dairy exports worth $2.32 billion, making it a lifeline for American producers. But that lifeline frayed fast when on February 4, 2025, Trump slapped a 25% tariff on goods imported from Mexico, injecting tension into one of the region's most important trade relationships. By the first quarter of 2025, U.S. dairy exports to Mexico had fallen 0.5% in value, and cheese shipments dropped 5% in volume. The numbers may seem modest, but they marked the first decline in years for America's top foreign dairy market, a sign that the erosion of trust was now turning into measurable economic loss. You're still here, and that means you're paying attention. Show your support with a like and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. While U.S. dairy shipments to Mexico began to slip, Canada was quietly stepping in. In 2024, Canadian dairy exports to Mexico jumped 67%, climbing from $2.86 million to $4.78 million. This wasn't a coincidence, it was a calculated move. Mexico had already made it clear that it wanted to diversify its suppliers, cutting back its dependence on American imports and protecting itself from sudden trade shocks. For Mexican buyers, the checklist was simple but strict: a fully traceable supply chain, high production standards, and guarantees that food security would never rest in the hands of a single foreign partner. Canada delivered on every one of those demands without the press conferences or political drama, just quiet, consistent results. Canada's quiet rise in Mexico's dairy market wasn't just about filling a supply gap, it was about meeting a higher ethical and transparency standard. On January 10, 2025, Canada introduced strict rules requiring dairy herds to follow a plant-based feed regimen, free from growth hormones, and without prolonged antibiotic use. These weren't marketing slogans, they were enforceable regulations. By April, Canada's Pro-Action traceability system, integrated with Dairy Trace and Simply Trace, allowed buyers to track every cow and every drop of milk from farm to shelf in real time. The U.S., by contrast, still relied on lot-based tracking as of May 2025, with limited digital records and far less granularity. That gap came to a head in June when Mexico rejected a shipment of American milk for failing to meet the ethical standards Canada had made the norm. By the first quarter of 2025, the shift was no longer subtle, it was written clearly in the numbers. The U.S. had lost 0.7 billion pounds of dairy exports, and while the volume itself was significant, the deeper concern was what it represented: a structural change in how buyers, especially in Mexico, were making decisions. This was not a temporary dip tied to seasonal demand or currency swings. It was a redirection of purchasing power towards suppliers who could meet higher expectations. In Mexico's urban centers, particularly among younger and more digitally connected consumers, the willingness to pay extra for products with transparent origins and ethical credentials had moved from niche preference to mainstream behavior. These buyers weren't swayed by promotional pricing or bulk discounts. They wanted a product they could trust, backed by visible proof of its journey from farm to table. Canada had positioned itself perfectly for this moment. With verifiable sourcing, strict production standards, and a marketing narrative grounded in traceable ethics, it became the natural choice for importers aiming to serve this growing segment. The U.S., still leaning on its historical dominance and cost advantage, had yet to align its practices with the evolving priorities of the market. In the modern dairy trade, trust has overtaken price as the most valuable currency, and America's reserves are running dangerously low. While the U.S. was losing ground abroad, its dairy industry was also confronting a slow-moving crisis at home. By mid-2023, only 290 licensed dairy farms were left nationwide, a steep decline that reflected years of consolidation and attrition. Many rural counties that once had a dozen small dairies now had only one or two, and in some areas none at all. The economics were brutal. Feed prices had climbed, relentlessly driven by global grain shortages and fuel costs. Labor was harder to find and more expensive to keep, while the price of maintaining or upgrading equipment had risen beyond the reach of many small operators. Interest rate hikes compounded the strain, inflating debt repayments and pushing more farms toward insolvency. For those already working on razor-thin margins, one bad season could tip the balance toward closure. Family-run dairies, often multi-generation businesses, were hit hardest. Some sold off herds to cut losses, while others simply walked away, leaving once productive land idle. The collapse of these local farms rippled outward, shrinking the economic base of small towns that depended on them for jobs, transportation contracts, and feed supply purchases. By contrast, Canada's dairy sector was insulated from much of this turbulence. With government-backed price insurance and production quotas that aligned output with domestic demand, Canadian farmers could plan years ahead without gambling on volatile market swings. The result was not just higher stability, but a system that kept small and mid-sized farms viable, a stark counterpoint to the pressures hollowing out America's dairy heartland. Beneath the quarterly trade figures and headline-grabbing tariff disputes lay a problem that had been years in the making: the structural imbalance of the U.S. dairy industry. For decades, America's competitive edge was built almost entirely on scale, producing more milk at lower cost than almost anyone else. But that model assumed buyers would always prioritize price and availability over everything else. In today's market, that assumption no longer holds. Canadian dairy may move in smaller volumes, but it commands a premium because every shipment arrives with a paper trail and a promise. Strict on-farm standards, transparent auditing, and digital traceability have become selling points that justify higher prices and win repeat contracts. For importers in Mexico, the difference isn't abstract, it's operational. Working with Canada means fewer disputes at customs, less uncertainty about meeting domestic standards, and a supply chain that can withstand political shocks. Working with the U.S. increasingly means managing risk, and in an industry where trust compounds over years, that's a weakness no production surge can quickly fix. This isn't just a trade contract, it's a signal that the balance of power in North America's dairy market has shifted. The question now is whether the U.S. will reform its system, embrace full transparency, and tell a better story for every gallon it exports, or cling to volume as its only selling point. In this new dairy war, trust has become the decisive weapon, and right now, America is losing. And if trust can erode so quickly in milk, a product the U.S. once dominated, what does that say about other industries built on the same assumptions? The next market to shift may already be in motion, and the warning signs are often invisible until it's too late. Appreciate you sticking with us till the end. If this content spoke to you, hit like, leave a comment, and subscribe. More critical updates are coming soon.